Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This week features a webinar series about ecological goods and services provided by native prairie ecosystems. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, John Pattison-Williams will be speaking about tracking grassland change in Canada, USA, and Mexico. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that we have another webinar tomorrow at noon about grazing and carbon storage by Dr. Edward Bork from the University of Alberta. And our final webinar of the week is on Friday at 12 p.m. about biodiversity conservation and food security by Dr. Branimir Jetvai from the Prairie Food System Vision Network. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, like always, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. Questions will be answered towards the end of the presentation, and feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsor, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, and our supporting sponsors are North American Helium, Nutrien, and SaskTel. So today's presenter is John Pattison-Williams, who is the president of Pattison Resource Consulting, which specializes in the interaction between environmental conservation and economic development, an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta in natural resource economics. John holds a doctorate in natural resources management from the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich in the UK, a Master's of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Alberta, and a Bachelor of Science from Augusta faculty at the University of Alberta. John is active in consulting and volunteer roles internationally and in Western Canada. Among other things, he is the coordinator of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Policy Committee and the director of the Biodiversity and Research Grants Program of the Alberta Conservation Association. John maintains an active research and teaching schedule and is a professional agrologist. He and his spouse, Naomi, and their two sons live and raise quarter horses on a family farm near Kingman, Alberta. So with that, I will pass it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I'll just share my screen now. And I'll make sure that I can see you, Caitlin. So it works? You can see everything?
Everything's good to go. Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who came today. I see 99 of you on the webinar, on the little participant list. So that's great. And it's always a little bit disconcerting speaking into the void, but I hope that what I can share will be useful and informative, and that it can stimulate some good questions coming forward. I also apologize. I have a bad cold. You know, I hate these springtime colds. And so if I do cough, I hope I can get to the mute button first. And I also have a slightly nasal tone today, so forgive me for that. All right, I'll move on here. First of all, as Caitlin did, but specifically, I want to acknowledge that I live on Treaty 6 territory. So living and working at the Stony Creek in Treaty 6 territory, which is the traveling route and home to the Maskwacis, Nahewak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, Tsuut'ina, the Métis, and other Indigenous peoples. And this is a particularly sort of special spot for us. This is Dried Meat Hill, just sort of outside of Camrose and at the border between on the Battle River, and a very special place to Indigenous peoples and to many of us that live here. So I'm here to talk about grasslands, which makes sense, I think, because this is the Prairie's Got the Goods webinar series. And I guess this is just to share one thing that I've heard in the last probably, I don't know, 5 to 10 years is how I've delved into more work on grasslands. I think wetlands were often sort of my my first love, as people say. But as the interaction on these sort of prairie landscapes of which I was born and raised, and went away for a while and then came back, they have sort of instilled something in my heart. And there's a phrase I heard down in the America's Grassland Conference, pardon me, a couple of years ago, which was, anybody can love the mountains. And I see these mountains in the background here. But it takes someone with real heart to love the prairies. And I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know that I have more heart than anyone else, but there is something about these tracts of land here that really, I think, for those of us that are interested and engaged with them, can really, really get into our vocabulary and our lives. Now, I wasn't certain about levels of interaction at this webinar, but I wanted to see, if we look at this last picture here, how many of you feel competent in inventorying or classifying grasslands? So in my mind, I'll envision people's hands going up here or there, and maybe we can come back to this at the questions at the end. But this is one of the major questions, I think, not of our time, but of this field, is wondering what grasslands are out there and what is the quality of them and what's going on with them. And so I thought this would be a nice thing to see who could identify and know what a foliar was and all those sort of things. But I'll just slightly move on from this one. But I want you to hold that in the back of your mind. How many of you, even if you live on the land in this biosphere, in this biome, could walk out there and look and identify some of those diverse and beautiful grasslands across the prairies? And if you're honest, even a bit like me, I'm an economist by training. I'm not very good at identifying them out on the land, and this feeds into sort of where I've come from. This is a drone image of some of our farm and ranching area, just southeast of Edmonton, and this is at the far northern reaches of the prairie biome. And this is sort of the mixed parkland area. But this is sort of the landscape that I come from and what informs my story and interest in all of this. And right at this point, why I like this picture is it shows the transition. This is sort of the southern spur of the boreal forest. And as you look, that's to the southeast, possibly towards where many of you Saskatchewan residents are right now, or Caitlin is. It looks, and you can see the transition from more treed to much more agricultural and cropped agricultural landscapes. And what's interesting to me is even in the last, I don't know, couple years, we've seen with commodity prices for canola going up, with drier conditions, we've seen that there's been a lot of clearing and a lot of conversion that's been happening anecdotally of grasslands. And even last year, I drove with my father, who was involved in sort of cattle ranching and that sort of stuff for many years. And we drove from our place down to Medicine Hat for a meeting. And it was striking from 20 years ago when I was a kid riding with him as well to go, some of the feedlots in the south, to see the real change of cattle production and the loss of grasslands along the eastern portions of Alberta and going down to Medicine Hat. A change has happened. And so, these are just a couple things of, as I went on to study and do some of this work and the ridiculous outfit of sort of, we academics like to dress sort of strange sometimes. All of it came back to, I want to understand this landscape and this place that I'm from, and what the transitions are occurring and what its impacts are, both to us personally, but also to society in general. And I guess when we think about all the subjects that are being covered this week in the Prairie's Got the Goods session, I think, what is prairie and where is prairie? But an important factor, sort of foundational to it all, is we're facing a loss, as I said, of this landscape. And this is a map. created by the Central Grasslands Roadmap out of the US, and of which Canada and Mexico are part of. And sort of, this is leading into my whole inventory, Canada, Mexico, US collaboration thing here today. But this is a signal that we're seeing. Forget about how accurate or what the precise numbers are in this, but this is the grassland biome. And a lot of estimates are signaling that it's the most imperiled ecosystem on the planet, more than the tropical rainforest. And so this is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Geological Survey, and they have sort of structured this a little bit in terms of what has been lost and also what is sort of what's remaining, and then they also have some maps around what is at risk. But I guess this is why we're here, is we're looking at, we're losing this landscape, and what can we do? What's happening here, and what can we do to possibly limit or slow down that loss? And so this was a question put forward by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and they funded some of this work, and I want to acknowledge that and the good team there. Now, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, maybe you don't know of them. I don't think I had heard of them really before I got involved here, but established in 1994 by the governments of Canada, Mexico, and the US. And the purpose is really to understand and seek solutions to various sort of issues that happen at a continental level. And one of these things is grassland and grassland loss. And so they have Grasslands and Conservation and Migratory Birds Project. And their idea is in funding work around how do we actually know what's happening with grasslands and how do we limit some of that change. Now, I'm not a remote sensing expert. I know enough to sort of probably be dangerous, but I'm more in that economics and policy realm of this circle. And so I asked this question, why do we measure grasslands and why do we care? And the title of this talk too is Tracking Change in Grasslands. And the important thing to consider here is we can talk about ecosystem services. We can talk about the perspectives of ranchers or indigenous people across this land. We can talk about policy too, about grassland conservation. And we can say, what are the economics behind it and all that sort of thing. But or carbon storage comes from it. But underlying all of those is a requirement for any of those working on the lower half of this circle. You need to know what's out there first. For me, as an economist, to sort of understand some of the sort of financial or profit drivers of change on landscapes across anywhere, but particularly the prairies, you need to know what they're doing out there. What are those ecosystem services? And what are the carbon storage? What are the nutrient retention? What are the biodiversity that's sustained? But even that, we don't know. We can't aggregate or understand any of those numbers if we don't know what's happening on the land. And so this is a picture of my dad. And so I always put that up as a reminder. It's like, why do we do this? And why do we care? Why should we care? And I think, one of the things I really feel is this, it impacts all of us in Canada and beyond and across North America. This ecosystem is vast. It's diverse in its own way. It's beautiful. And it has a big role in carbon stocks and grazing and ways of life for people. And so it matters what's happening on this landscape, even though it seems in some cases empty, which we know isn't true. But one of the purposes then for the Commission for Environmental Cooperation was to ask, okay, what's going on out there with grasslands and where are we at? And so this is just a couple of screenshots from last year. I hosted and facilitated 2 workshops with grassland remote sensing experts from US, Canada, and Mexico. And these were great events, great participation, great people involved, and a lot of wisdom, collective wisdom in the group. And the first was to sort of identify what's going on out there on it last May. And then in September was to sort of follow up some of the big questions that everyone had, so that once they'd met and had some discussions, you could think, okay, what are the issues that are still outstanding, to try to figure out how we weave these things together. Because the big sort of elephant in the room is that there are a lot of great projects out there that seek to track grassland change. They're often provincially specific or state specific. They sometimes are larger, but they like at a national or a continental level. But I don't know if any of you have worked, if you're a scientist or if you've worked with scientists, but we like to really committed to our models and our approaches. And we feel like, we've got the right, we've got the right answer. We've taken an approach and it makes sense. Imagine getting dozens of these same people together with conflicting sort of, well, they did it one way, you did it the other way, and actually you're getting different results. So sort of the big thing here is that there are different forecasts of grassland loss. Some are saying there's more, some are saying there's less. And yet, unless we all sort of work together and understand where it's at, it's hard to make any policy changes to protect this landscape. And so this is just a bit of an understanding of we had, and people I've talked to, but also that presented at some of these meetings that informs this. And these are 3 from Canada, 2 from Mexico, and then 3, pardon me, a few more from the US, just to share their approaches and their strengths and weaknesses. And that was really useful. And what's coming out, and this is, I don't know, a little teaser, I hope, is that what we're trying to accomplish from this, which isn't yet quite complete or public, is that there will be sort of a cohesive document that's coming from this that looks at what is out there in terms of grassland remote sensing and ground truthing, and what are the limitations and best practices, and then data needs for how we could possibly have a big enough data set to sort of align the various inventories and standardize them. And so I think this would be quite a useful resource for any of you that are also involved in grassland conservation. It should be now ready by this fall. But now, looking at tracking change, and I want to dive into a few of the different inventories out there. And so we have, this is what I did. Pardon me, I have to cough here. Thanks. Sorry. At least you're not in the same room with me, right? Then I'd be coughing all over you. The beauty of virtual presentations. We found that there was sort of 5 major North American-wide inventories that actually went over, crossed borders. And there was about 6 sort of dominant US inventories out there, about 8 in Mexico. And what really was interesting to me as a Canadian is there was a lot of different inventories in Canada. And so I want to dive into some of those and what's going on in that area, because, this is, as I said, foundational to even many of any of the questions around economics or policy or implementing conservation measures across Prairie Canada. So I don't know how many of you are really familiar with the Mexico context, but the Great Plains, or the grasslands biome that I sit in the northern reaches of it, and I'm sure many of you sit across it here in Canada. But at the very bottom end of the same biome is down in the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico. And, different in many ways, different issues, cultural issues, and sort of drivers of conversion. They're facing a lot around woody encroachment, desertification from climate change. But, these are 2 of the major ones down in Mexico. And in fact, really looking forward to, in about 2 weeks, having a more targeted workshop with Mexican grassland researchers that the CEC will also be hosting, and I'll be facilitating, and to try to dig in a little bit more into what's happening down there. So these are the two of the major ones, and I'm going to focus on the Canadian ones a little more, but I just wanted to let you know about those two. This is a major initiative in North America, sort of in the US, sort of US led, but with tendrils, I guess, into Mexico and into Canada. And again, the interactive nature is challenging. I would say, how many of you have heard of the Central Grasslands Roadmap? And I would hope that many of you would raise your hand. This is a wonderful, I would say, initiative, sort of, I think, initiated slightly out of the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in Colorado. But they've been hosting meetings of sort of a large swathe of stakeholders and rights holders to seek to understand, how to limit grassland change. But this is a facet they also have supported, recognizing what, speaking of before, the importance of knowing what is out there so that you can know what to do about it. They've been doing a lot of work in this realm, and they supported this mapping exercise for the Central Grasslands Roadmap. And if ever you're working in some of this realm, you'll run into the names of Sarah Olam and Drac Twidwell and others that are really sort of instrumental in this initiative. But what's kind of cool, I think, on this one is looking at what has been converted and what is vulnerable to conversion. So they have a matrix looking at, so what are the pressures driving grassland loss, whether it is, typically in the South, as if it's woody encroachment in the US, as I said, or even in a lot of parts of sort of the central US, Mexico and the US. And then up here in Canada, again, so I'm also a university professor, so I like interaction. So what would you think that the big driver of loss is here in Canada? And I would say, speaking to myself here, that, many folks in Canada, there's sort of a cognitive dissonance between what is perceived to be true and what is actually true. And, there's a narrative that, a lot of it is urban expansion, ranchettes or transportation corridors. And of course, those things are true in certain sort of highly populated areas. But in terms of, conversion on the whole, it really is, in Canada, a lot is from cropped agriculture. And, we farm. We have, a decent sized grain farm, as well as cattle and horses as our family. And, I understand there are pressures to convert, but what we see around here is a lot of, I think 6 quarters in our area just this last year were plowed under it would be very little native grassland, but a lot of tame has been converted now and is back in cropped or put into cropped agriculture just because of those profit margins. Anyway, I'm digressing a bit here about drivers of change, but this is an instrument that I think has gained a lot of traction, is this roadmap tool in the US. And now, we're saved the best for last, Canadian inventories. What do you think the main Canadian inventories are? And you could, recite these to yourselves right now, or if you're sitting with friends to watch this, you could talk about it. Again, another quiz. But I'm going to go through a few here that we can look at and think about. Because it's important, I want to say it's important to understand what efforts are out there, because it's not just the scientists or the remote sensing folks in the labs that are doing it. But these impact all of us if we're out ground truthing. So it impacts any of you that are farmers or ranchers on the landscape that might be participating to help out. Say, hey, I saw some, this used to be pasture and now it's not, or this used to be native grassland and now it's not. And as we try to track that very fluid change, it's important. And we're Canada. We like to, and natural resource legislation means, you know, a lot of it is, this is housed in, or this is provincial jurisdiction, especially for private landscapes. And so each province sort of has their, I'm an Albertan, the Made in Alberta thing. We have Made in Saskatchewan, Made in Manitoba approaches to measuring this. This informs this broader discussion because it adds to, they can be very precise locally, but also they're hard sometimes to translate. So one of the big data sets out there is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And they have a land use time series data set and meta-analysis that collects and curates different land use information across the country. And I want to really acknowledge Melody Green and Emily Lindsay for their great work on this. And this is Andy Davidson, was sort of the main person out of AFC for many years. He still leads some of this. But this is often every around 5-year intervals. And we look at what's happening across the landscape in terms of change. And so this is a very detailed one. This is a very sort of formidable approach that's done and updated every 5 years. So, you know, be aware of this one. They're a great source of knowledge and great work coming out of this location. And that's at a national level. I want to just touch on a few of the provincial ones. Also, Environment Canada does have sort of a national one here that I think I've lowered down. But provincially, many of you Albertans in the crowd. I want to thank Livio Fent very much for some of his input and discussions about some of the grassland vegetative index and vegetation inventory in Alberta. So there's been about 3 different initiatives in Alberta to track the change in grasslands. And you know, this is a very interesting one here. This was from 1993 to 2013. And you can see some of the, if you're familiar with Alberta, you can see some of that change there. So no discernible change in some areas, and you know, interesting methods behind each one of these. And now for the Saskatchewan folks. The Prairie Landscape Inventory, and this is, you know, I want to acknowledge Thiago Frank and Bea Pietres for their excellent work and their teams on this. And I think they've taken a really good approach to looking at what is, and also being able to identify and distinguish between native and mixed and tame grassland, which is one of the big challenges, especially in remote sensing. How do we know from a satellite, an eye in the sky far away, to be able to be very clear on the ground what's there? So this is one I'll mention as well, a nod to Saskatchewan. And then this is the Manitoba Grassland Inventory. Again, there's been others sort of in the past, but this is sort of the flagship one right now in Manitoba, I would say. Nazim Badreddin out of the University of Manitoba has been sort of leading some of this work. He was also involved in the Prairie Landscape Inventory. They're carrying on work on this, and I think this is quite a really good model as well, an approach. So if you're in Manitoba, note that you also are being cared for in terms of understanding what grasslands are out there. But as you can imagine, cohesive national grassland inventories have been a challenge. And this is speaking to some of the, you know, the work that I've been doing with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. I want to speak to this because this is fun. This was an initiative, and maybe some of you have heard of it. It started in 2021. It actually concludes next week, next Friday, isn't that right? So this is I think a very exciting and comprehensive approach that's looked specifically on grasslands across the country. This was supported by the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund out of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the purpose of this is to integrate the existing inventories across Canada into a single, consistent, credible, and accessible product. That's no small objective. And I hope that some of you, if you're involved in some of this work, can understand that, they had a big job. And Nassim Badreddin from the University of Manitoba did lead the remote sensing component of this, and great work done by Heather Pete Ham. Call out to Heather from Forage, Saskatchewan. She led a lot of the ground truthing on this work. And of course, the collected rest of the team. But the idea was to sort of stitch these together, got a common approach, and move forward. And I know they've done an immense work, and I think they've got Manitoba, Saskatchewan, parts of Alberta now done, and they've been working in the central grasslands of BC and Ontario and Quebec, and also I think into the Maritimes, to have sort of a clear and cohesive narrative and an approach, a model taken. Now, of course, there's still the other initiatives out there, but this is something that has been sort of quite important nationally. And in fact, if you're interested, on Friday, just 2 days from today, they are having the National Grassland Inventory for Canadian Agriculture Summit will be held virtually to present all the findings of this initiative. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested, to you can reach out to me if you like, or to Caitlin. I'm sure she could share some of that. And one of the key parts, though, of this initiative was this idea of we have all the satellites out there, and the work that Saskatchewan and Manitoba and other inventories are doing, but then they want to figure out how to ground truth a lot of this work. And they have a really fascinating Survey 123 data gathering platform that they use. So you could, even in areas that did not have cell coverage, which I think for many of us, we understand that's an issue out in these rural areas. They can go up and put it in, and then it uploads once you get back into areas with coverage. So that way they did the remote sensing and ground truthing and other approaches. So anyway, that's the national inventory, which will be shared more on Friday. And I put this as preliminary, but this is something it will be wrapping up sort of this summer. But to understand all those inventories that are out there, the physical extent of them, the definition of grasslands you use, the timelines of when they've been completed. There's a lot of good work out there, and you don't want to repeat all of it. And so how do you build upon what a good foundation, but also aware that a lot has changed. Technology has advanced. Fields changed quite quickly. People, you can plant every year, things can move a bit. So I think this is where it's hoping this can be sort of an easily updatable platform, a reporting platform that people can access for interest. And within that, just want to think about, as we track that change, within the different initiatives, what are the strengths and weaknesses of them? I mean, I'm sure many of you, even if you're here at this talk, you're passionate about grasslands, whether you're a remote sensing person, whether you're a farmer, a rancher, whether you're a student, or whether you're an academia or you represent an environmental NGO. There's a passion here for these landscapes. And that's, if you can harness that, that's, I think, a real wonderful asset. And the multiple inventories across the whole continent, this is good. There's interest. All that's happening. And there's long-term research that has gone into it. And there's wonderful advances in satellite technology that have allowed even better ways to monitor from afar. And yet, in any sort of good understanding, you realize there's some limitations too. One, people can't always agree, or they use different definitions of grasslands. And so if we go back up to that quiz at the very start of the question, of the presentation, we have to be clear of what we're talking about. As a kid growing up, grasslands to me was, some brome and alfalfa mix we use for our horses. Now I see the error of my ways, that it's a lot bigger than that. But then you think of, so definitions is key. Integration between these different initiatives, like I say, people don't always talk, or you have a move towards a certain approach. And once you get a few years in, it's very hard to change course if you realize that, actually someone else is doing it a different way. and maybe they're doing it better, or they're doing it in a way that has some advantages anyway. Ground truthing is often limited because, strangely, possibly or not many people across the country are really good at identifying those grass types. And it's almost like a lost art or lost science. And so finding people that are really willing and able to get out through citizen science or ground truthing is essential. Another weakness is that in many of these initiatives, there's, I would say, a gap in the sort of the link between Western science and traditional knowledge from Indigenous communities. You know, many Indigenous communities are both through their sort of traditional territories, but also the reservations, vast amounts of intact grassland remain on First Nations and under their control and management. And so, and yet, so, you know, often I think with this sort of high technological remote sensing approach, that it misses some of that traditional Indigenous knowledge that can integrate and weave well into some of this sort of this braiding approach. So I want to flag that as well as a weakness. And then to note that there are really, you know, there's good methods for the GRS's grassland remote sensing work that's going on. There's a willingness to share, and it's been fascinating as I've really hosted and facilitated both the continental with the Mexicans, the Americans, and the Canadians. There's a willingness, there's an openness to share, even if they disagree on some pretty, you know, sticky points. It's a good community of people that are willing and know the importance of this information in terms of conservation of this ecosystem. So there's really great stuff going on. As long as you are transparent and clear with your methods and willingness to share, that can really assist. In terms of accuracy, to know whether those remote sensing approaches are working well, we need good ground truthing. We need sort of humble and engaged citizens to be part of these initiatives. You know, so call out to any farmers or ranchers or landowners out there that are got a bit of time, you're driving around, maybe you could engage with some of this work and help out. And then, of course, long-term support is essential. So both in terms of integrating, how often you update these layers. You know, 10 years is a lifetime, really, or even 5 years is in some ways. A lot of land use change can occur by then. But you need financial investment and technical investment along the way to keep this going. Sorry, I'm almost done. I wish I could control that cough, but also end user engagement is also needed along the way. I just want to say a few next steps, and I'm really encouraged by sort of the ongoing collaborative meetings that are happening with these sort of all the people involved with tracking grassland change across the continent. It's going on well. There's joint sessions being proposed at remote sensing conferences by academics. And there's learning across countries, and there's a willingness to share data. There's some questions around how you do store that data and where it's stored because of, you know, data rights and access, computing power of a platform, who would house it that's big enough, would have the computing power to do that, and the security. But those are things that people are really talking about now. And then there's just ongoing work happening around sort of coherence, and that's the idea of a coherent national story. So we can have a common metric that we can say what is really going on across both Canada and the continent on this biome. And there's great initiatives like the CFGA survey system and engaging with different inventory professionals that sort of are contributing to that. And of course, I can't let, you know, the grass grow under me. We've got to finish that CEC report come September after a few more workshops and input from these experts. And to say at the end, just as I conclude the talk, I'm at 40 minutes, why do we measure and why do we care? And I'll say two things here. At the Central Grasslands Roadmap 2 years ago in Fort Collins, Colorado, there was a wonderful keynote talk by a high-ranking member of the Department of Interior in the US who was an Indigenous man. And, you know, talking about this whole landscape, if we look at our continent, it was like a robe, a green robe over North America. And, you know, for many justifiable reasons and, you know, food production, those sort of things. But we've seen that this robe has been torn and clawed at and ripped apart, and it's in tatters today. And there's not a lot left. And so as we seek to sort of, with a wise approach, seek to sort of limit any more tearing or knitting together some of these areas that are broken, you know, this is important, not just from an economics perspective, but from a social and a human side, right? For many of you that live on this landscape, that you know, you see change happening, and I think we should care for these endangered species and for these endangered habitats. And this is a drone image actually from one of our quarters, and I think, you know, one of these reasons I do it too, to understand this whole, the value and the beauty and the importance of this ecosystem, and all the goods that the prairie has. You do it for your next generation. And if, sort of throw this up, this is my wife and our two little boys last summer, doing some haying. And you think, I really hope that, you know, as much as I love getting on a combine too, or all those sort of things, I hope there are places where they can ride horses, where they can jump on hay bales, and they can have and that, you know, they can see some of these amazing bird species and wildlife across this landscape, that, you know, is really under threat. So we hope we do it for those next generations and our love of the land. So that's why we measure it, why we care. And I want to acknowledge these wonderful people that have been so helpful along the way, for me, and also those that took photos. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the awesome presentation, really informative and detailed. We already have a lineup of questions ready, so here we go. The first one is from Ross. What are the limitations for a better Canadian inventory that can better inform policy direction?
Thank you, Ross, for that question. Limitations to inform policy direction. I think what we're inferring from here too is sort of a cohesive, clear, consistent narrative. And I think a challenge that occurs when we have different inventories that update at different time periods, you can sometimes say, hey, there's really bad, you know, grassland losses happening here. But then you have another one say, actually, it's not that bad. Or actually, maybe it's not happening here. And then you see, you know, anecdotal evidence from farmers or ranchers driving by and say, well, how is that possible? Because it is, I see it happening. But if the narrative is not there and isn't consistent, I think that is a loss or a limitation. Because policy, I don't know how many of you love policy. I used to think it was kind of, but actually I get more excited about it now. There's no clear grassland policy for conservation in Canada. It's woven into many other policies around agricultural support systems, or like how conservation easements fit in certain areas, or for endangered species and that sort of thing. But without to sort of develop a consistent policy, you need a consistent message that supports it. So I don't see, without a strong foundation and more collaboration with these different inventories, how we can actually get a clear sort of grassland policy in place. Hopefully that answers a little bit.
So, and Colin is wondering, do these inventory projects have IT specialists in data combining, such as XML defining specialists?
Yes. I mean, obviously, they differ, but I think one thing I've been sort of constantly impressed with by each of them is that, yeah, there's a lot of really highly trained and excellent people engaged in I will say most of the projects. You know, some have closed, right? They've ended, and they use aerial imagery that was wonderful, you know, but also things have changed so much. And so you need that foundation, but sort of being right at the cutting or bleeding edge of some of this technology is important. And I do think so a lot of the leading ones do have that, but yeah, something to flag though.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth says, as an economist, I would be interested in your thoughts on ecologically invasive species that are promoted agriculturally because of their importance economically, such as alfalfa, brome grass. How do we get ranchers and farmers to understand the importance of not planting these near remaining native prairies?
Yeah, what a great question. And I think, you know, as an we hear a lot about some of the invasive species in the last few months through some of the work with the Prairie Habitat joint venture. You know, we've had workshops, engagement workshops with, pardon me.
So sorry that you're sick. It's so unfortunate.
I'm
Every
sorry
time
for
you
you.
go into the presentation, like, it's
I'm sorry for
terrible.
you. I'd hate to watch this recording and like, oh gosh. Um, But I think, yeah, some of the indigenous workshops in particular were really, the comments are like, man,
Mhm.
invasive species, man, how do we handle this? And yet, in some ways, our perceptions of what an invasive or non-native species are very different based upon which community we live in. And, you know, a lot of farming communities often think, oh, what the heck? This is great. Throw on a lot more alfalfa, it'll be fine. I think it relies as an economist on some. I mean, we can say we can educate some of these things, but the financial incentives are very non-existent, either in payments for ecosystem services or sort of perverse policy approaches where actually you can get insurance to see down to something, or it's tax deductible to you know your equipment to plow under or to knock down trees, those sort of things. So I think it needs a more sort of as an economic analysis. I think the drivers aren't in our favor right now for grassland protection. Um, but there's innovative ways that I'm sort of, you know, been thinking about and researching in the last few years. So maybe drop me an email if you want to chat more about those.
And Adolf is wondering if you have any recommended solutions to fixing this lost grassland. Big
Ah,
ideas, smaller ones, but since we're on the topic.
ah, no, thanks, Adolf. That's a great question.
Yeah.
The challenge with, you know, it's like you know, in some ways it's like wetlands. You're like, you drain one, but to restore it, you know, it can look nice, but what are those ecosystem service functions that are there? And you know, different estimates, it's great research out of various groups across the prairies, but saying, you know, it takes 20, 30 years for carbon sequestration potential to rise back. What about biodiversity? Grasslands, from what I understand, are even almost even harder in some ways to restore back to their sort of full sort of native structure. And I know I've met with some people out of Texas and also Canada that are like native prairie seed banks and the work they're doing there. And I think that's part of it. Restoration is part of it, but it's very time consuming. And I think so it has to be one tool in a toolkit, but we can't think there's a silver bullet that will stop all of this. It's like a shotgun approach, to use the hunter's analogy. You need a whole bunch. And I do believe in regulatory measures. I know I probably shouldn't, but in certain worlds that I'm in, I think there's a role for governments to sort of say, hey, hang on, are you doing this? I know there's a individual profit motive for this, but actually there's a societal benefit. Maybe you should stop it through regulatory approaches, or maybe there are financial incentives to maintain. And you know, you think of the conservation easement programs, you think of you know, forage restoration programs and lot payments for ecosystem services. Those come into play. So I think it's going to take all of them. And I'm usually not. I am an optimist, and I think, yeah, we can do this, but it's going to be a long road ahead, I think. So.
Me too. Um, and Cameron is wondering if you can tell us again about some of the details regarding the meeting on Friday that you mentioned, or if there's a website that you can direct people to.
Yeah, it's the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association sort of final meeting of this Canadian Grassland Inventory. And yeah, they've they're saying the more the merrier to come to this. But it is invite only. So if I think in the sense of there's no website where you can sign up, but we can send if you're interested, how to get in touch with me. Maybe I can give my email in the chat. Drop me a note and let me do that. If everyone can see this, I'll just send my
I think you can select if you want to send it just to the host or to everybody when you send the chat there.
host and panelists. That works.
No, I think that's just you and I. Is
I just
there send
only
there?
only host or host and panelists is my only option.
Okay, send that and then I'll forward it.
Perfect. Yeah, because I'd really encourage you if you're interested to come to that because there will be sort of 4 levels of talks, one about how they engage with stakeholders. So I'm going to be giving some of that information. And then they'll hear about the classification system, and you hear about the remote sensing and how it all wraps up and actually where they're hoping to go with it. So I do think it's really valuable. So yeah, if you want to come, I can drop me a note and I'll send you the invite and the link.
Perfect. That'd be great. I'm just going to remind everyone, I know there's a few hands that are up. If you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section or into the chat, and we'll be moderating questions through there just because we have so many people in the webinar. We can't be unmuting everyone, but we're happy to answer questions, so just type it in there. Our next question, John, is recent irrigation project announcement in Saskatchewan. How big of a threat is irrigation to grasslands?
Yeah. I mean, I try to remain politically neutral on many of these things. And I think I am sympathetic to a lot of, crop agriculture producers. And, we are one, and many of our friends and family are across the prairies, across all 3 prairie provinces involved in it. I will say that, it's hard not to realize that it will come at a cost to native grasslands. So yeah, it's a threat. It is. And of course, as an economist, there are trade-offs. You could do benefit cost analysis on it, but I think it would veer towards the sense if you have more water, you can, produce crops on these areas that would be been previously unsuitable for it. And so I think, to be honest, I'm skeptical of some of those initiatives. I think that both in terms of water conservation, as we're, thinking of drought on the prairies and climate change models shifting, I think it's a risky move, personally, and professionally. And I think that, and linked within that is some of these, biofuel initiatives that I think, and for aviation fuel, I know outside of Calgary, they're talking about, a Western producer had an article about looking at, well, if, we want green fuel for airplanes, so let's, these biofuel products, and no Cargill's involved, and in some of them, and I think it's sort of like the biofuel market that happened 20 years ago in the US. Suddenly you had all this land, rather than producing for food, for human consumption, it's used for vehicles and those sort of things. And that exacerbates trends of loss, because if there's a financial motivation there, you're sitting there with the sun. Hang on, we have a family to feed. We have, mortgages to pay. Land prices have gone, what, 8%? I think I heard at a presentation a few weeks ago. For the last 20 years, land prices across the prairies have gone up 8% each year. Phenomenal. So like a quarter section here, 300, 200,000 a couple of years ago is about $800,000 now is sort of where we're at in our area. How can you make payments on those things as farmers? And so I know there's pressures, but I think maybe there's some other models there, but I think that irrigation in areas, I think we should be cautious about that right now. And I think also some of these aviation fuel or biofuel trends are something to look at critically. Right.
Absolutely. So, I never even thought about that before, but you're absolutely right. The demand that would put on grasslands, the pressure.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And in some ways, the danger is this pits. A risk can be that it pits 2 sectors of agriculture against each other. And we rely on this great community engagement in rural areas, right? But then you got a diminishing beef sector. I mean, you see the beef, the herds are dropped off in Alberta in particular. I don't know the Saskatchewan numbers per se, but yeah, you see some tension between both of these 2 sectors. And then that makes some pretty hard social issues in these communities too. So you get people pissed off at each other, and farmers know how to hold a grudge for a few years too, don't they? So don't we? Yeah. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The last question that we have right now, it's more of a comment from Penny. Grasslands are so important for birds of all sorts. It seems like there's less grasslands around for them to use. Um, and she says, we were just out looking for bluebirds and can't find any. And this is when they arrive back from their winter travels. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, Penny, and sort of amazingly, I saw a bluebird yesterday, 2 days ago, driving home from the university down back at the farm, which is amazing because I haven't seen one in a long time. I'm like, oh, amazing, it's a
Yeah.
bluebird. But I think, I don't know, do economics come into play? I won't pretend they do in everything, but the wetland birds have seen a great increase, an influx of support. They're iconic. They can be hunted in the way that there's a driver for conservation. There's big funds available for strong hunting lobbies to say, hey, we want to keep wetlands because we want to shoot ducks and geese. All the love to Ducks Unlimited and Delta Waterfowl here. But, there are reasons around that. I'm not advocating for hunting bluebirds or anything. That's horrible thing. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying grassland birds have been, it's like that first picture of, the mountains are easy to love because they're grand, they stand up all over the place. But the prairies, it's more subtle. And I think many of the birds reflect that landscape too, right? They're not as seen, they're smaller, um, they're remote. And it's tragic the way we're seeing the loss of grassland birds. And I know Barry Robinson out of Environment and Climate Change Canada, great guy, good friend. He's doing really good work on sort of some of these grassland bird models and their losses in different areas. But this is where we see the most endangered species. I know Dr. Mark Boyce on CBC the other day was saying that, a colleague of mine, saying, well, we look like we might lose the sage grouse in Alberta this year. It was like 15 left. And despite all the efforts been put in to conserve them, without habitat and good habitat, there's no home for these things to live on. So yeah, it is a real sadness. And as I tie back to even my idea, why do we do it? Well, for the next generation, so we can see some of these species that are so wonderful, if subtle. They're there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that great answer. That was really in detailed. I think that's all the questions that we have right now. So I just want to let our attendees know that we've been recording this webinar and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel in the near future. That's youtube.com/user/skpcat. And you can find this one there. You'll be able to find, we have like over 200 other recorded webinars. So there's other ones about, we've had somebody from the government of Alberta talk about greater sage grouse in Alberta, I think a year or two ago. So we've got kind of every topic covered just about. I made a note about Barry Robinson. That would be an interesting presentation for the future. But so many of our past webinars are uploaded there and it's a great resource. So when you leave today's webinar, there's a quick 1-minute survey that if you don't mind filling it out, we really appreciate that. And John, thank you so much. Thanks for pushing through your cold and speaking to us and going through such detailed information. It was really, really useful. And I think the discussion was really fabulous. And
Wonderful.
yeah,
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for enduring my coughing fit. So
we hope you get well soon.
yeah, I'm sure I will. So
Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you online tomorrow at noon for a presentation about grazing and carbon storage. So with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.